At 15, Mary Stuart walked down the aisle in a white gown, crowned Queen of France. 30 years later, she knelt on a cold scaffold in England, waiting for the axe to fall. A life that began with wedding bells ended in blood and silence. Was Mary, Queen of Scots, destroyed by destiny, by politics, or by the betrayal of those she trusted most? This is her story, radiant, tragic, unforgettable. Tragic. History does not always wait for age, strength, or wisdom. Sometimes, it crowns a child before she can even open her eyes fully to the world. In December of 1542, within the gray walls of Linlithgow Palace, a newborn girl was placed into swaddling clothes. Her father, King James V of Scotland, was already gone. 6 days before, he had collapsed into fever, beaten down by years of conflict and disappointment. And now, he lay in his tomb. The crown passed not to a warrior, nor to a seasoned ruler, but to a baby girl. Her name was Mary Stuart. She was 6 days old, and she was already a queen. The cradle became her throne. Courtiers and nobles gathered not to celebrate a birth, but to weigh the political value of the child who had just entered the world. To them, Mary was not simply a daughter, not simply an infant who needed milk and lullabies. She was a symbol, a bargaining chip, a fragile thread in the tangled web of alliances that stretched across Europe. In her blood flowed the legacy of the House of Stuart, the ambition of her French mother's Guise family, and distant ties to the mighty Habsburgs. That bloodline made her priceless, but it also made her vulnerable. Scotland, at that time, was a land of storms. The nation had endured endless wars with England, and inside its own borders, noble families clashed with one another, each seeking to hold influence over the throne. With the death of James V, the realm fell into the hands of regents, men who ruled in the name of the baby queen but thought first of their own ambitions. A 6-day-old sovereign could not defend herself. She could not speak. She could not decide who should guide her. From her first breath, Mary's life was no longer her own. It is tempting to imagine childhood as a time of innocence, of play, of simple joys. For Mary, that illusion barely existed. Even as a toddler, she was never simply a child. She was a contract in human form. At the age of 5, her destiny was sealed in negotiations. Scotland's leaders, desperate to secure the nation's future, promised her hand in marriage to the French Dauphin, Prince Francis. The marriage would bind Scotland to France, creating a powerful alliance against England. For Mary, it meant leaving the land of her birth, trading the mists of Scottish castles for the gilded corridors of the French court. Picture it: a little girl torn away from her homeland, placed on a ship that carried her across the cold waters of the Channel. Behind her, Scotland's hills receded into memory. Ahead of her lay a country that would raise her not as a guest, but as a queen in waiting. In France, she was trained in languages, music, dance, poetry, and diplomacy. She was given tutors who shaped her mind to match her destiny. She grew up not with the freedom of a child, but under the watchful gaze of courtiers who measured every step, every word, every gesture. To the French, Mary was both exotic and essential. She carried with her the promise of uniting 2 crowns. They dressed her in silks, taught her to glide across polished marble floors, and surrounded her with the young nobles of the Valois court. Yet beneath the splendor, there was always the whisper of politics. Her laughter was weighed, her beauty discussed, her marriage prospects analyzed. Even at 10 years old, her worth was measured not in who she was, but in what she could bring. And yet, Mary was not an empty vessel. By all accounts, she possessed a natural grace, that charmed those around her. She was tall for her age, striking, with auburn hair and eyes that seemed to carry both mischief and melancholy. Chroniclers would later speak of her intelligence, her eloquence, her ability to hold a room's attention. But these gifts were double-edged. A queen who was too captivating could inspire loyalty, but also jealousy. Meanwhile, in Scotland, factions tore at one another. Protestants and Catholics battled for dominance. Nobles shifted allegiance like shadows shifting with the sun. And far to the south, in England, the Tudor monarch Henry VIII and later his daughter Elizabeth I watched carefully, wary of the little queen whose blood gave her a claim to their throne as well. Mary's very existence was a threat to England, and a prize to anyone who could control her. Thus, her childhood was not a safe haven. It was a rehearsal for survival. Each lesson, each ceremony, each bow of the head was not simply etiquette. It was armor, crafted not of steel, but of performance. By the time most children are still stumbling through school, Mary was practicing the art of queenship, mastering languages, balancing faith, and learning to smile while enemies calculated her downfall. Imagine being 10 years old and knowing that you were a pawn in a game played by kings and cardinals. Imagine hearing whispers of your marriage not as a matter of love, but as a matter of state survival. Imagine realizing that the cradle that had held you was also a cage. That was Mary's reality. And yet, within this gilded captivity, hope glimmered. The Dauphin Francis was not merely a political match. He was her companion in childhood, shy and frail, but bound to her in ways no one else was. Their connection would grow, and in time their marriage would crown her Queen of France. But for now, she remained the child queen suspended between two worlds, the Scotland she had left behind and the France that was shaping her future. Mary Stuart's infancy as a sovereign illustrates one of the cruelties of monarchy. Crowns do not weigh less on small heads. If anything, they crush more. For every day of her early life, she was the center of schemes she could not understand, wars she could not fight, and faiths she could not reconcile. Scotland called her its queen, France called her its daughter-in-law, and England called her its enemy. Her story had only just begun, and already the seeds of tragedy had been sown. A 6-day-old queen, a 5-year-old bride, a child molded into an emblem of power. History would never let her be simply Mary. From the moment she opened her eyes, she belonged not to herself, but to the world. France welcomed Mary Stuart as though she were born for its throne. From the moment she arrived at 5 years old, the French court molded her into a living jewel. Her beauty, her height, her fiery hair, these were not just personal features. They were national assets. In a world where appearances spoke louder than treaties, Mary's presence beside the young Dauphin, Francis, symbolized the unbreakable bond between Scotland and France. Together, they were the embodiment of the Old Alliance, centuries of mutual protection against England. When Mary turned 15, the promise that had guided her childhood became reality. In April 1558, within the resplendent walls of Notre Dame Cathedral, she was wed to Francis, heir to the French throne. Imagine the spectacle: golden light streaming through stained glass, incense thick in the air, the bells of Paris ringing with the force of a nation's heartbeat. Mary wore white satin embroidered with silver, her crown shimmering like fire in candlelight. Thousands lined the streets to glimpse her carriage, whispering that Scotland's queen had brought not only her kingdom, but also a kind of enchantment to France. It was a marriage not only of crowns, but of symbolism. The Valois dynasty gained prestige by binding itself to the Stuart bloodline. Scotland secured a protector in the might of France. But for Mary herself, behind the pomp and ritual, there was also a human truth. She had grown up with Francis, and despite his frail body and timid nature, she cared for him. Theirs was not a union forged in passion, but neither was it entirely cold. It was perhaps the closest thing to tenderness politics would ever allow her. Only a year later, fortune lifted Mary to dazzling heights. In 1559, Henry II of France died in a jousting accident, and Francis ascended the throne as Francis II. At just 16, Mary became Queen Consort of France, the most glittering position a young woman could imagine. She had two crowns, Scotland by birthright, France by marriage. No queen of Europe seemed more blessed. Poets compared her to Venus. Courtiers bent the knee not just in loyalty, but in awe. And yet, the brilliance of her reign was a fragile illusion. Francis was weak, physically and politically. He was barely more than a boy, his health delicate, his confidence dependent on the manipulations of Mary's powerful Guy's relatives. Real power lay in the hands of her uncles, the Dukes of Guise, who ruled in Francis's name with ruthless zeal. They were Catholic hardliners in a France boiling with religious tension. Huguenots, the French Protestants, resented the Guise stranglehold, and civil unrest stirred. The young royal couple were little more than ornaments in a house already on fire. Mary, however, played her role flawlessly. She carried herself with grace, spoke fluent French, charmed ambassadors, and lent her crown an air of legitimacy. Still, whispers grew that she was too closely tied to her Guy's uncles, that she represented not a unifying queen, but a factional one. Her elegance became a mask that hid not only her personal uncertainty, but also the instability of the realm. Then, in December 1560, the mask was torn away. Francis, barely 17 years old, fell gravely ill with an ear infection that spiraled into an abscess of the brain. Doctors bled him, prayed over him, applied useless remedies. Nothing worked. Within weeks, the boy king was dead. His reign had lasted only a year and a half. Mary, not yet 18, was a widow. Picture the scene: a young queen dressed now in mourning black, wandering the corridors of the Louvre with tears streaking her face. The bells of Notre Dame tolled again, this time not for celebration, but for death. The incense was no longer sweet, but suffocating. Where once the court had shouted, "Vive la reine," now there was only silence, punctuated by the rustle of servants moving to remove her emblems of power. It was a cruel reversal. One moment, Mary was Queen of France, elevated to the pinnacle of European royalty. The next, she was a foreign widow with no place at court. Catherine de' Medici, Karen de' Medici, Francis's mother, who had long watched Mary with suspicion, wasted no time asserting dominance. With her son Charles IX now king, Catherine became the true power of France, and Mary, beautiful, foreign, politically inconvenient, was pushed aside. Her uncles, the Guises, still wielded influence, but even they could not secure her position. In the cutthroat politics of France, Mary was suddenly redundant. She had no children to tie her to the throne, no husband to defend her, and no power to claim. She was a queen without a crown, a widow without a home. At 17, Mary faced a decision no young woman should bear. Should she remain in France, a relic of a failed marriage, surviving on her Guise family's fading power? Or should she return to Scotland, the land of her birth, where her crown still waited, though tarnished by religious conflict and noble rebellion? It was like choosing between two storms, one of neglect, the other of chaos. Mary chose Scotland. In August 1561, She sailed back across the channel, her ship cutting through mist and waves like a blade through fabric. Behind her lay the glittering court of France, the place where she had learned to smile in gold and silk, the place where her husband's body now rested in a cold tomb. Ahead of her lay the jagged cliffs and windswept castles of Scotland, a homeland she had not seen since she was 5 years old. She returned not as a child, but as a widow, scarred by loss, and as a queen determined to reclaim her birthright. But the Scotland she returned to was not the Scotland she had left. The country had been transformed in her absence by the Protestant Reformation. John Knox thundered from pulpits, condemning Catholic idolatry. Noble factions schemed for advantage. The once Catholic stronghold now seethed with division. Mary was a Catholic queen stepping into a Protestant storm. It is here that her life shifted from dazzling promise to the first true tremors of tragedy. For while France had molded her, dressed her, and presented her as a jewel, Scotland would test her, strip her illusions, and demand of her something far harsher than grace: survival. The girl who had been a queen in swaddling clothes, who had been crowned again as a teenage bride, was now about to enter the darkest act of her story. The glittering crown of France had slipped from her head. In its place, the thorny, blood-stained crown of Scotland awaited. And though she walked off her ship with determination, history was already sharpening its knives. Mary returned to Scotland carrying both the dignity of a queen and the vulnerability of a widow. She had been shaped by the elegance of France, but now she stepped into a land that was harsher, colder, and less forgiving. In Edinburgh, the air was thick not with the perfume of roses and incense, but with the smoke of hearths and the voices of men arguing in Parliament. The nobles eyed her warily. The Protestants distrusted her Catholic faith. And across the sea, Elizabeth I of England watched, calculating what her cousin's return might mean for the fragile balance of power. Mary was 23, still young, still radiant, but now aware of how fragile crowns could be. She needed stability. She needed an ally strong enough to hold Scotland's fractious nobles in line and, perhaps, to reinforce her claim to the English throne. It was in this precarious context that she made a choice that would shape the rest of her life. She married Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley. On the surface, it seemed like a brilliant match. Darnley was her cousin, tall, handsome, and most importantly, he too had Tudor blood. Through him, Mary strengthened her claim to Elizabeth's throne. The union promised not only to stabilize Scotland, but also to place her one step closer to ruling England. Nobles grumbled, but many accepted the logic. For a brief moment, it appeared as if Mary had chosen wisely. But appearances are treacherous. Darnley was not the partner Mary needed. He was vain, arrogant, and consumed with ambition. He expected not to be the queen's consort, but her equal, even her superior. He demanded the crown matrimonial, an arrangement that would have given him the right to rule Scotland in his own name if Mary died without heirs. Mary, sharp and politically aware, refused. That refusal poisoned their marriage almost immediately. What had begun as a union of strategy turned into a battlefield of egos. Darnley drank heavily, boasted recklessly, and spent his nights in taverns or with companions of questionable repute. Whispers spread that he was unfaithful. Mary, for her part, tried to maintain her dignity, but every slight, every drunken insult eroded the thin fabric of their marriage. And then there was David Rizzio. Rizzio was Mary's Italian secretary, a gifted musician and diplomat who had quickly become one of her most trusted advisors. He was intelligent, loyal, and always by Mary's side. But his closeness to the Queen made enemies. The Scottish nobles despised his influence, and Darnley, insecure and jealous, convinced himself that Rizzio was more than an advisor, that he was Mary's lover. The accusation was absurd. But in a world where rumors carried the weight of truth, Darnley's jealousy was enough to ignite disaster. March 1566. Mary was 6 months pregnant with her first child. She had gathered with Rizzio and a few companions for supper at Holyrood Palace. The fire crackled in the hearth, candles flickered against the stone walls, and the Queen, weary but hopeful, sought a moment of peace. Then the doors burst open. Darnley led the charge. Behind him stormed a group of armed nobles. Their faces were grim, their hands gripping daggers and swords. Mary's heart froze as she realized what was about to unfold. She tried to shield Rizzio, who clung to her skirts in terror, but it was no use. In the flicker of torchlight, the nobles dragged Rizzio from the room. Mary cried out, pleading, clutching at their sleeves, but Darnley stood by, his face twisted with rage and triumph. Within moments, the air was filled with screams. Rizzio was stabbed again and again, over 50 wounds, according to some accounts, his blood pooling on the palace floor. The Queen, pregnant and trembling, was forced to witness the slaughter of the man she trusted most, killed almost at her feet. The message was clear. Darnley and the nobles wanted to show her that she was not invincible, that even within her own chambers, her authority could be pierced. It was not only an assassination, it was a humiliation. Mary survived that night, but something in her broke. The murder of Rizzio changed everything. What had been a troubled marriage became an open war between husband and wife. Trust was gone. Love, if it had ever truly existed, had curdled into hatred. Mary loathed Darnley, not just for the crime itself, but for betraying her at the moment she was most vulnerable. She was carrying their child, the future king, and yet her husband had chosen blood over loyalty. The nobles, too, had revealed their hand. They were willing to defy her openly, to turn her palace into a battlefield, to spill blood under her roof. Scotland was no longer merely unstable. It was dangerous. Every step Mary took was shadowed by threats. And yet, amid the grief and the fear, she gave birth. In June 1566, Mary delivered a son, James. For a moment, the heavens seemed to open. A male heir secured the Stuart line, and the cries of the infant prince echoed like a promise of renewal. But even this blessing carried an ominous shadow. The same nobles who had killed Rizzio now calculated how they might control this child. Darnley, intoxicated with pride, saw in James a reason to push harder for power. And Mary, exhausted but unbowed, realized she was caught in a tightening vice. Between her husband's arrogance, her noble's ambition, and the whisper of English eyes watching from across the border. The murder of Rizzio was more than a personal tragedy. It was a spark that set fire to Mary's reign. It showed that Scotland's queen was not untouchable, that even within her own home, betrayal could come from those closest to her. It stripped away any illusion of safety, leaving her exposed to the storms that would soon rise. In the months that followed, Mary's smile became more guarded, her words sharper. She had endured humiliation and loss, but she refused to yield. Yet the irony of her fate was already clear. Every attempt to reclaim her power would only draw her deeper into the quicksand of suspicion and violence. The queen, who had once been a child pawn in France, was now a young mother in Scotland, scarred by betrayal, her throne trembling beneath her. Her marriage, once a hope for stability, had turned into a weapon aimed directly at her heart. And history, ever merciless, was preparing its next blow. By 1567, the marriage of Mary, Queen of Scots, and Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, was nothing but a hollow shell. What had begun as a union of dynastic promise had decayed into open resentment, humiliation, and fear. Darnley, once celebrated for his handsome looks and Tudor blood, was now despised even by those who had once supported him. He was arrogant, unstable, and reckless, a man who had squandered every ounce of goodwill he possessed. For Mary, he had become more than an embarrassment. He was a liability. The events at Holyrood, where David Rizzio had been butchered in her presence, had permanently severed the fragile bond between husband and wife. Mary had forgiven many insults in her short life, but she could not forgive that. She had watched her trusted friend die beneath the daggers of men emboldened by Darnley, while she herself carried their unborn child. From that night forward, Darnley was her husband in name only. And yet, despite his betrayal, Darnley remained dangerous. He was still the father of the infant Prince James. He was still, technically, the king consort of Scotland. His existence created a knot of politics that could not easily be untied. If Mary dismissed him, he might still find allies among the nobles or the English. If she tolerated him, he could drag her name through scandal. Either way, he was a threat. By late 1566, Darnley's health had begun to deteriorate. Some whispered it was syphilis, the result of his reckless living. Others thought it was a wasting fever. Whatever the cause, he grew weak, paranoid, and increasingly erratic. In the autumn, he left court and returned to his father's estates. He seemed on the verge of collapse, physically, politically, spiritually. Then, in January 1567, he returned to Edinburgh. Officially, it was to reconcile with Mary. He took up residence at Kirkfield, a house near the city, and there the Queen visited him, even spending nights at his side. To the public, it looked like a gesture of forgiveness, perhaps even a revival of their broken marriage. But behind closed doors, it was something far more complex. Mary knew her reputation was fragile. If she abandoned Darnley outright, she might look cruel, or worse, complicit in his downfall. By appearing to care for him, she protected herself from accusation. Or so she thought. On the night of February 9th, 1567, a great banquet was held in Edinburgh to honor a wedding in the Queen's household. Mary attended, leaving Darnley at Kirkfield. He was weak, recovering from illness, but not bedridden. He was given attendance, and the Queen promised to see him the next morning. By midnight, the city had quieted, its narrow closes swallowed by darkness. Then, before dawn, an explosion ripped through the night. The house at Kirkfield erupted in fire and rubble, its timbers and stones scattered across the ground. The blast was so violent that people in the city rushed from their beds, convinced an earthquake had struck. Flames licked the sky. Smoke rose in columns. And as the wreckage smoldered, the crowd gathered, whispering one name: Darnley. But when the dust cleared, the truth was stranger than the blast itself. Darnley's body was not found in the ruins of the house. Instead, it lay in the orchard nearby, alongside that of his servant. There were no burns on the corpse, no sign of death by fire. Instead, his body bore marks of strangulation, or perhaps suffocation. Others said he had been stabbed. The details blurred in rumor, but one thing was clear: Darnley had not died in the explosion. He had been killed beforehand, and the blast had been staged to cover it. The whispers began immediately. Who had done it? Who had orchestrated this strange, theatrical murder? Suspicion swirled like smoke, and it clung to one figure most of all: Mary. The Queen had the most to gain from Darnley's death. He was despised, unstable, and a constant threat to her authority. With him gone, she would be free. And then there was the matter of James Hepburn, the Earl of Bothwell. Bothwell had long been one of Mary's staunchest allies. He was bold, reckless, and fiercely loyal, or so she believed. Rumors of an affair had already begun to circulate, fueled by the Queen's increasing reliance on him. To Mary, Bothwell was a protector in a hostile land. To her enemies, he was her lover, the man for whom she would kill. When Darnley's body was carried from Field, the narrative was already written in the minds of the people. Mary and Bothwell had conspired together. The explosion, the strangulation, the secrecy. It was too convenient, too dramatic, too incriminating. Whether or not she was guilty, the perception of guilt became a weapon her enemies would wield, and the nobles were eager to wield it. Scotland's lords had grown restless with Mary. Her Catholic faith, her French manners, her perceived arrogance, all had alienated her from much of the nobility. Darnley's death was the perfect pretext. They could accuse her, undermine her, and ultimately depose her. The Queen, who had survived betrayal after betrayal, now stood on the brink of ruin. Mary herself seemed shaken in the immediate aftermath. She attended the funeral, her face veiled, her expression unreadable. To some, she looked grief-stricken. To others, she looked cold, detached, almost guilty. Chroniclers noted how swiftly the rumors spread, how quickly the people began to turn against her. A queen accused of murdering her husband was no queen at all. And then, as if to confirm every suspicion, she made a decision that would haunt her forever. She married Bothwell. The timing could not have been worse. Barely 3 months after Darnley's death, Mary wed the very man most suspected of orchestrating the murder. To her supporters, it may have looked like an act of defiance, even love. To her enemies, it was proof. Proof that she had been complicit. Proof that she was unfit to rule. The murder of Darnley was more than a crime. It was a turning point. It was the moment when Mary, once a queen of radiant promise, became a figure of suspicion. It marked the end of her fragile stability and the beginning of her fall. History still debates the truth. Was Mary complicit? Was she an unwitting pawn swept into Bothwell's schemes? Was she simply careless, blinded by loyalty to a man she believed could protect her? We may never know. But what is certain is this: the explosion at Field did not just kill Darnley. It shattered Mary's reign. From that night onward, she would never again be seen as an innocent queen. She was a widow for the second time, but this time she was also a suspect. The whispers of murder clung to her like a shroud, and her crown began to slip, one bloody finger at a time. The murder of Lord Darnley had left a crater not only in Edinburgh's streets, but in Mary's reputation. Every whisper, every rumor, every suspicious glance seemed to point in her direction. A queen was supposed to be untouchable, cloaked in divine authority. But now, Mary Stuart was a woman surrounded by shadows, and the figure at the heart of those shadows was James Hepburn, the Earl of Bothwell. Bothwell was everything Darnley had not been: strong, decisive, fearless, even reckless. He was no boyish consort begging for recognition. He was a soldier, a commander who had proven himself in battle, and above all, a man who seemed willing to defend Mary when others abandoned her. To a queen drowning in intrigue, He appeared as a lifeline, but lifelines can also drag you down. In the months following Darnley's death, Bothwell positioned himself closer and closer to Mary. He was her counselor, her protector, her ally in the storm. To her enemies, this intimacy was damning proof. To her, it may have felt like survival. For all her intelligence, all her royal training, Mary had always been most vulnerable when it came to matters of the heart. Bothwell offered her something she had long been denied, strength she could lean on. But the line between protection and possession soon blurred. Historians still argue about what happened in April 1567. Some say Mary went willingly, drawn into Bothwell's arms by her own desperation. Others insist she was abducted, even assaulted, forced into a marriage she could not refuse. The truth lies buried in contradictory letters, hostile chronicles, and propaganda from her enemies. What is certain is that on May 15, 1567, Mary wed Bothwell, barely 3 months after the murder of Darnley. It was a decision that shocked Scotland. Even her most loyal supporters recoiled. To the nobles, it looked like confirmation of every suspicion. The Queen had conspired with Bothwell to kill her husband, and now she had crowned her guilt with marriage. To the common people, it was a scandal so loud it drowned out her years of dignity and poise. A queen who married her husband's suspected murderer forfeited not just respect, but legitimacy. Mary must have felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. The woman who had once been adored as the shining Queen of France was now whispered about in taverns as a seductress, a conspirator, a traitor to her own crown. The throne of Scotland, once precarious, now trembled as if an earthquake had cracked its very foundation. Bothwell, for his part, was no savior. He was bold, yes, but also rash and arrogant. He believed that with Mary at his side, he could command the loyalty of Scotland's nobles. He underestimated their hatred, their ambition, their willingness to rise against their sovereign. Within weeks of the marriage, the lords of Scotland gathered their forces. They called themselves the Confederate Lords, and their cause was simple: to destroy Bothwell and depose Mary. The clash came swiftly. In June 1567, at Carberry Hill, Mary and Bothwell confronted the rebel lords. The Queen, dressed in armor, tried to rally her troops, but the tide was already against her. Her forces melted away, nobles defecting one after another. She stood on the hillside, abandoned, her husband powerless, her enemies triumphant. In the end, Bothwell fled, riding into exile, never to return. Mary was left alone, surrounded by hostile lords. The men who had once bent the knee to her now dictated terms. They stripped her of authority, paraded her through the streets of Edinburgh like a criminal, and hurled insults at her as she passed. The Queen of Scotland, who had once been cheered in Paris as the Bride of France, now endured the jeers of her own people. Worse was yet to come. The Confederate lords forced Mary to abdicate. In July 1567, she signed the documents, under duress in captivity, relinquishing her crown to her infant son James. He was barely 1 year old, a baby placed upon a throne while his mother languished in prison. For Mary, it was the ultimate humiliation. To be undone not by foreign armies or rival monarchs, but by her own nobles, by the very men sworn to serve her. Bothwell, the man for whom she had gambled everything, vanished into exile. Captured at sea, he ended his days in a Danish prison, raving in madness, his body broken, his legacy one of failure. He could not save her. He could not even save himself. Mary, meanwhile, was carried to Lochleven Castle, a fortress surrounded by water, its gray walls rising like a tomb from the mist. There she was kept under guard, a prisoner on her own soil. Her jewels were taken, her documents signed under coercion, her crown lost. A queen reduced to nothing more than a captive widow, shorn of power and dignity. And yet, within that prison, Mary's spirit did not collapse. She plotted escape. She wrote letters. She dreamed of return. In her heart, she must have asked herself 1,000 times, had Bothwell been worth it? Had she chosen love, or at least the illusion of love, over survival? Or had she simply been cornered, forced into a marriage that destroyed her? The price of Bothwell was everything: her throne, her freedom, her reputation. He was the match that ignited her downfall, the figure who turned her from queen into prisoner, from sovereign into suspect. History judges Mary harshly for this choice. Some see her as reckless, blinded by passion. Others see her as a victim, manipulated, even coerced. But whatever the truth, the outcome was the same. Her reign as queen in her own land was over. What remained was exile, captivity, and a slow descent toward the scaffold. Bothwell's name would be cursed, her own name stained. Yet in that stain, in that very scandal, Mary became unforgettable. Because tragedy clings not to those who live wisely, but to those who burn brightly, even as they fall. The queen who once ruled 2 crowns was now a prisoner on an island, her destiny chained not to her will, but to the whims of men. And still, in the darkness of Loch Leven, she dreamed of freedom. The waters of Loch Leven mirrored the sky like a sheet of steel. Within its gray fortress, Mary Stuart lived not as a queen, but as a prisoner. She was 24 years old, stripped of her crown, separated from her son, and betrayed by those who once knelt at her feet. Her world had shrunk to stone walls and guarded corridors, her companions reduced to a handful of servants and the echo of her own thoughts. Yet the story of Mary, Queen of Scots, was never one of quiet resignation. Even in captivity, she plotted, dreamed, and prepared for resurrection. At Loch Leven Castle, her captors forced her to sign the Act of Abdication, placing the infant James on the throne. Her pen scratched across the parchment under duress, but her mind rebelled. She told herself it was temporary. Queens could be dethroned, but they could not be erased. The crown might rest on her son's tiny head, but her blood, her presence, her claim, those could not be extinguished. It was here in this island prison that Mary revealed both her resilience and her recklessness. She attempted escape more than once, disguised as a washerwoman, slipping into the shadows. The first attempts failed. But in May 1568, with the help of loyal supporters, she finally slipped past her guards, boarded a small boat, and crossed the dark waters to freedom. Her flight electrified Scotland. For a moment, it seemed the Queen might reclaim her throne. Her supporters rallied, and she gathered an army of 6,000 men. But fate dealt her another cruel blow. On May 13, 1568, at the Battle of Langside, Mary's forces clashed with the Confederate lords. The battle was swift, bloody, and decisive. Her army was crushed. Defeat forced Mary to make a choice more desperate than any she had faced before. She could retreat deeper into Scotland, perhaps to the Highlands, and continue the fight. Or she could cross the border into England, placing herself under the protection of her cousin, Elizabeth I. To many, the choice seemed clear. England was her only refuge. Elizabeth, though wary, was family. Surely she would not abandon a fellow queen. Surely blood and shared lineage would triumph over politics. But Mary miscalculated. On May 16, 1568, Mary crossed the River Solway into England, exhausted, desperate, and clinging to the hope of mercy. She wrote to Elizabeth, calling her dear sister, appealing to her as one sovereign woman to another. She begged for protection, for understanding, for recognition as a queen unjustly deposed. In her mind, Elizabeth would welcome her as an ally, perhaps even help restore her to her throne in Scotland. Instead, Elizabeth saw her as a threat. From the English queen's perspective, Mary was not a cousin to be pitied, but a rival to be feared. Mary's bloodline gave her a legitimate claim to the English throne. To English Catholics, she was the rightful queen, a living banner of resistance against Elizabeth's Protestant reign. Sheltering Mary would be like harboring a spark near dry tinder. It risked setting all of England aflame. Thus, Elizabeth's response was cautious, calculated, and cold. She refused to meet Mary face to face, claiming that as a sovereign she could not risk legitimizing another claimant. Instead, she ordered Mary placed under guard for her own protection. What began as hospitality soon hardened into imprisonment. For Mary, the shock must have been unbearable. She had gambled everything, her throne, her son, her future, on Elizabeth's goodwill, only to find herself caged once again. But this time, the prison was not a castle in Scotland. It was a network of English fortresses, each colder and more alien than the last. Over the next 19 years, Mary became a ghost queen, a sovereign without sovereignty. She was moved from one estate to another: Carlisle, Bolton, Tutbury, Sheffield, Chartley, Fotheringhay. At each stop, the walls changed, the guards changed, but the reality remained the same. She was watched, controlled, her letters intercepted, her visitors monitored. The queen who had once commanded armies now asked permission for her meals, her hunts, her prayers. And yet, Mary never surrendered her sense of majesty. She dressed in finery when she could, held court with her small retinue, and signed her letters as Mary R. She refused to call herself a subject, insisting she was still a sovereign queen, wrongfully imprisoned. Her pen became her weapon. She wrote endlessly, to ambassadors, to allies in France and Spain, to the Pope, pleading her case, weaving webs of alliances, begging for intervention. Her words crossed borders even when her body could not. But with every letter, every plea, she also deepened Elizabeth's suspicion. The English queen saw not a helpless widow, but a rallying point for Catholic plots. And indeed, Europe buzzed with schemes to free Mary and depose Elizabeth. Rebellions flared in the north of England. Priests whispered her name in secret masses. Mary's very existence made her dangerous, whether or not she lifted a hand. The tragedy of this chapter in Mary's life is the slow erosion of hope. At first, she believed Elizabeth would help her regain her crown. Then she hoped at least for an honorable freedom, perhaps exile in France. When both hopes failed, she clung to the possibility that her son, James, would one day restore her honor. But as the years passed, her son grew distant. Raised under Protestant guardianship, molded to serve Scotland's nobles rather than his mother. The child she had risked everything to protect became another barrier to her return. Mary's 19 years in England were not years of peace, but of suffocation. Each day was another reminder that she was both too valuable and too dangerous to be released. She was a prize and a prisoner, a queen in name and a captive in reality. Her appeal to Elizabeth had not saved her. It had sealed her fate. Standing at the threshold of English captivity, Mary must have felt the weight of her choices pressing down like a crown of lead. Had she stayed in Scotland, she might have fought another day. Had she fled to France, she might have lived in relative safety. But she had chosen England. She had chosen Elizabeth. And in that choice, she had walked willingly into her final prison. Captivity is not only the closing of doors, it is the slow erosion of dignity. For Mary Stuart, the 19 years she spent in England were not one long imprisonment, but a series of cages, each with its own shape, its own wardens, its own rituals of humiliation. She was a queen without a court, a mother without her child, a woman stripped of her freedom, yet still too dangerous to be forgotten. Elizabeth never allowed Mary to meet her face to face. This, more than chains, was the sharpest insult. Queens were meant to deal as equals, sovereign to sovereign. But Elizabeth denied her that recognition, keeping her at arm's length, as though Mary's very presence might ignite rebellion. Instead, Elizabeth confined her in a labyrinth of castles and manors. Carlisle, Bolton, Tutbury, Sheffield, Chartley, and finally, Fotheringhay. Each place became a chapter in her long descent from majesty to martyrdom. Her conditions were not those of a dungeon, but neither were they freedom. She lived in suites of rooms, sometimes richly appointed, sometimes damp and drafty, always under guard. Her meals were provided, her servants monitored, her correspondence intercepted. She was permitted to hunt, to embroider, to pray, but never to move without permission. Her world shrank to stone walls, locked gates, and the watchful eyes of wardens who knew their careers depended on her containment. Yet Mary refused to surrender her identity. She dressed with care, maintaining the image of a queen even when no subjects were there to see it. She held miniature courts within her confinement, receiving her small household with ceremony, issuing orders with the authority of a monarch. She signed her letters Mary R., Mary Regina, never allowing her captors or herself to forget who she was. This performance of sovereignty was her shield. If she could not reign, she would at least refuse to vanish. But captivity corrodes even the strongest spirits. Over time, her body weakened. Rheumatism set into her joints, leaving her in pain. The once vivid queen who had ridden horses and danced in French halls now limped, hunched, her beauty dimmed by illness. The dampness of English castles gnawed at her health, and her years of stress etched lines into her face. She was still tall, still commanding, but her radiance was shadowed by fatigue. Isolation gnawed at her heart as well. She was cut off from her son James, who was raised by Protestant guardians in Scotland. Letters passed between them, but they were cold, formal, and often intercepted. The bond between mother and child, already fragile, withered. James grew into a cautious, pragmatic ruler, more concerned with his survival than his mother's fate. Mary had once dreamed of him as her deliverer, the child who would restore her honor. Instead, he became distant, another reminder of her losses. And yet, even in chains, Mary remained a symbol. To Catholics across Europe, she was the rightful Queen of England, the figure who could restore their faith to the throne. To Elizabeth, she was a living danger, a constant temptation to rebels. Every plot, every whisper of insurrection, every priest caught smuggling messages seemed to circle back to Mary. She did not need to lift a finger. Her existence alone threatened Elizabeth's crown. So Mary became both powerless and powerful. She could not command armies, but her name could move them. She could not sit on a throne, but her image adorned the dreams of conspirators. She was both prisoner and rallying banner, silent yet thunderous in her symbolism. The rhythm of her captivity was marked by letters. She wrote constantly, appeals to kings in France and Spain, pleas to the Pope, messages to allies real and imagined. Each letter was a lifeline, cast into the sea of politics. Some reached their targets, others were intercepted, decoded, and placed into Elizabeth's hands. Each one added to the case against her, building the narrative that Mary was not just a captive, but a conspirator. Time became her enemy. Each passing year chipped away at her hopes. 19 years is long enough to see a child become a man, to see allies die, to see the world forget your voice. It is long enough to turn defiance into weariness, to make even the strongest spirit falter. Yet Mary endured, never admitting defeat, clinging to the dignity of her role as queen. Imagine the silence of her chambers at night, the crackle of a fire, the shuffle of guards outside, the scratching of her quill on paper. Imagine her prayers, whispered into the damp stone, asking for deliverance, for forgiveness, for justice. Imagine her pacing, her hands aching with arthritis, her mind circling the same questions again and again. Would she ever see freedom? Would Elizabeth relent? Would her son remember her? She was like a candle burning slowly in a drafty room. Each day stole a little more wax, each gust threatened to extinguish her. Yet the flame persisted. That was Mary's defiance. Not a great rebellion or a sudden escape, but the stubborn refusal to let herself be erased. Still, imprisonment shaped her destiny as surely as a battlefield might have. She became, in those 19 years, a figure transformed. No longer the dazzling bride of France, no longer the ambitious queen of Scotland. She was now the Catholic martyr in waiting, a woman whose suffering was her legacy. And that legacy was not confined to her. Across England, priests and rebels whispered her name. Across Europe, monarchs debated how to use her. She became a weapon in the hands of others, her captivity the spark for countless plots. Some she encouraged, others she merely tolerated. But all of them carried her name closer and closer to treason in Elizabeth's eyes. Mary must have sensed that her prison was also her stage, that every move she made was watched, recorded, twisted into evidence. And yet, she played her part with dignity, knowing the end might come not in freedom, but in execution. 19 years. Nearly 2 decades of waiting, hoping, praying, writing, and suffering. 19 years of watching the world change while she remained locked in stasis. 19 years of slow death before the axe would fall. Her captivity was not just a pause in her story. It was the crucible that forged her legend. After 19 years of confinement, Mary Stuart's life had become a theater of shadows. Every letter she wrote, every word she whispered, every glance at her attendants was scrutinized, intercepted, dissected. She knew she was surrounded by spies. She knew her jailers reported every detail to Elizabeth's council. Yet she could not stop herself. Hope, like a stubborn weed, pushed through the cracks of her despair. And hope, in the end, became the snare that closed around her. The 1580s were years of feverish anxiety in England. Catholic Europe was restless. Spain, powerful and devout, glared across the Channel. Priests slipped into England in disguise, saying Mass in hidden chambers, urging resistance against Elizabeth's Protestant rule. To these believers, Mary Stuart was more than a prisoner. She was the rightful queen, a beacon of their faith, a living alternative to Elizabeth. So long as Mary lived, Elizabeth's crown sat uneasily on her head. It was in this atmosphere of suspicion that the Babington plot was born. Anthony Babington was a young Catholic gentleman, zealous and eager, who dreamed of liberating Mary and restoring Catholicism in England. In 1586, he and a circle of conspirators devised a plan: assassinate Elizabeth, free Mary, and place her on the English throne. It was reckless, dangerous, and doomed from the start. But Babington and his companions believed in it fiercely, and they reached out to Mary for her support. What they did not know was that the entire plot was already in the hands of Elizabeth's spy master, Sir Francis Walsingham. Walsingham was a master of intelligence, a man who believed that Elizabeth's survival depended on rooting out treason before it bloomed. He had spies in every court, every household, every tavern. He had long known that Mary was the rallying point for rebellion, and he waited patiently for her to incriminate herself. The Babington plot was the perfect opportunity. Using double agents, Walsingham allowed messages to pass between Babington and Mary. But these letters were not free. They were monitored, intercepted, and decoded. Ingeniously, the correspondence was smuggled in and out of Chartley Castle, where Mary was confined, hidden inside the cork stoppers of beer barrels. To Mary, it must have felt like a miracle that after years of silence, she could finally write freely to her supporters. She poured her thoughts into these letters, urging Catholics to be brave, thanking them for their loyalty, and fatally consenting to the removal of Elizabeth. That single agreement sealed her fate. The moment Mary's letter was decoded, Walsingham had what he needed. He had proof, written in her own hand, that she was complicit in a conspiracy to assassinate Elizabeth. Whether she truly meant it, whether she was entrapped, whether the plot was even realistic, these questions did not matter. The words were there. The Queen of Scots had crossed the line from captive to traitor. But pause for a moment. Imagine Mary as she wrote those letters. Imagine her bent over a table in her chamber, the candle flickering, her hands stiff with rheumatism, her heart racing with hope. After nearly 2 decades of silence, she must have believed God had opened a path to her deliverance. Every scratch of her quill must have felt like a step closer to freedom, to the throne, to vindication. She could not see the invisible web around her, the trap that grew tighter with each word. She thought she was reaching out to allies. In truth, she was writing her own death warrant. In August 1586, the trap was sprung. Babington and his fellow conspirators were arrested, tortured, and executed with brutal efficiency. Their deaths were horrific, their bodies displayed as warnings. But the true prize was Mary. She was transferred to Fotheringhay Castle, a grim fortress in Northamptonshire, to await trial. The news spread like wildfire. Across Europe, Catholics trembled with outrage. How could one queen put another on trial? How could a sovereign be judged by her rival? To Elizabeth's government, the answer was simple. Mary was not a queen anymore, but a subject guilty of treason. To Mary herself, it was an abomination. She declared it plainly: "I am a queen, not a subject. I cannot be tried by any court in England." But her protest meant nothing. Elizabeth's council had what it wanted: evidence, confessions, and the chance to remove the threat once and for all. The Babington plot was not merely a failed rebellion. It was the climax of 19 years of suspicion, the final link in a chain that had been tightening since the day Mary crossed into England. Walsingham had played his hand with brilliance and cruelty. He had baited the trap, guided the conspirators, and let Mary condemn herself. And now, with her letters exposed, there was no escape. But here lies the deeper tragedy. Mary was guilty not only of conspiracy, but of desperation. She had clung to hope because it was all she had left. She had believed in allies because the alternative was to admit she was utterly alone. Her crime was not only treason, but trust. The fatal trust that she could still control her fate. The Babington plot revealed Mary's vulnerability more than her villainy. It showed a queen stripped of power, grasping at the promises of strangers, tricked into signing her own doom. And it revealed Elizabeth's England as a place where mercy could not coexist with survival. In the candlelit halls of Fotheringhay, Mary must have realized the truth. Her life had reached its final act, the child queen of Scotland, the radiant bride of France, the embattled widow, the prisoner. Now she would become something else. A martyr, perhaps. A warning, certainly. A queen brought down not by armies, but by letters. Her quill had been sharper than any sword, and it had cut her own throat. Fotheringhay Castle rose against the sky like a tomb waiting to be sealed. Within its stone walls, Mary Stuart prepared to face the ultimate humiliation, a queen brought to trial like a criminal. The Babington plot had given Elizabeth's ministers the excuse they had long sought. No longer was Mary simply a captive. She was, in their eyes, a traitor who had conspired to assassinate England's sovereign. And for that, there could be only one verdict. The trial began in October 1586. The great hall of Fotheringhay was transformed into a courtroom. Elizabeth herself would not preside. She was too shrewd to be seen as a judge in her cousin's case. Instead, she sent commissioners, 40 noblemen, peers of England, to weigh the evidence and pass judgment. But the truth was already written. Walsingham's spies had gathered the letters. Babington and his conspirators were already dead. The machinery of justice was only a formality, a theater of guilt. Mary entered the hall with dignity, though 19 years of captivity had left her weakened. She walked slowly, leaning on the arms of her attendants, yet she carried herself with the poise of a sovereign. She wore black velvet, her head held high, her face pale but resolute. To the commissioners, she was not the frightened woman they might have expected. She was still a queen, and she would face them as such. She refused to plead guilty or innocent. Instead, she attacked the very premise of the trial. "I am a queen," she declared, her voice echoing against the stone. "I am not subject to the laws of England. I came here for protection, and I was betrayed. I cannot be judged as a subject, for I am no subject. I am Mary, Queen of Scots, anointed by God, sister to France, cousin to Elizabeth, mother of the King of Scotland." Her words carried the force of both pride and desperation. She knew the commissioners would not spare her, but she would not let them strip her of her crown in spirit, even if they had taken it in law. The evidence was laid out. Her correspondence with Babington, decoded by Walsingham's men, the words in which she had seemed to approve the assassination of Elizabeth. To her accusers, it was damning. To Mary, it was entrapment. She insisted the letters had been manipulated, that she had been lured into a trap, and in truth, she was not wrong. Walsingham had orchestrated the entire scheme, but the commissioners were not there to weigh fairness. They were there to confirm guilt. The trial lasted 2 days. Mary defended herself alone, denied the right to legal counsel. She appealed not to their mercy, but to history, to God, and to Elizabeth herself. She begged for a private audience with her cousin to explain her innocence directly. Elizabeth refused. The two queens who had haunted one another's lives for decades would never meet. In the end, the verdict was inevitable. On October 25th, the commissioners pronounced Mary guilty of treason. The sentence was death. News of the verdict swept across Europe like wildfire. In France, her relatives protested. In Spain, the Catholic King Philip seethed. The Pope thundered in Rome, but in England, the mood was divided. Some rejoiced that the Catholic menace would finally be removed. Others shuddered at the thought of executing an anointed queen, fearing it would bring divine wrath. Elizabeth herself hesitated. For weeks, she wavered. To kill Mary was to set a precedent that one queen could authorize the death of another. It was a dangerous act, a sacrilege in the eyes of many. But to let her live was to invite further plots, further conspiracies, further dangers. Elizabeth agonized, signing the warrant, then delaying its delivery, then feigning ignorance when her counsel pressed her. She wanted Mary dead, but she did not want the guilt of her blood on her conscience. Meanwhile, at Fotheringhay, Mary prepared herself for the inevitable. She asked for her chaplain, but the Protestant authorities denied her a Catholic priest. She prayed alone, clutching her rosary, murmuring Latin prayers under her breath. She wrote farewell letters to her allies, to her son James, letters filled with both resignation and quiet hope that her death would not be in vain. She dressed each day with care, as if each morning might be her last. To her attendants, she spoke with calm courage. "Do not weep for me," she told them, "for I die in the faith of Christ, and I die as a queen." She was determined that, if she must perish, she would do so not as a victim, but as a martyr, a sovereign whose dignity could not be destroyed even by the axe. On February 1st, 1587, Elizabeth finally signed the warrant. Some say she did so reluctantly, others that she allowed her counsel to pressure her hand. The document was sent to Fotheringhay. Elizabeth would later claim she had not meant for it to be executed so quickly, that her ministers had acted without her knowledge. But the ink was on the page, and the axe was already sharpened. Mary received the news with serenity. She did not cry out, did not beg. Instead, she thanked God that her long captivity was ending. "The world," she said, "has wearied me. I am ready to go to my Lord." Imagine the scene in her chamber that night. Candles flickered against the damp walls. Her attendants wept quietly as they packed her belongings. Mary herself knelt on the cold stone floor, her hands folded in prayer, her lips whispering the words of the Psalms. Outside, the guards sharpened their pikes, and the executioner oiled his blade. The castle seemed to hold its breath. For 19 years, Mary had waited. Now, at 44, her waiting was over. She would step onto the scaffold, not as a prisoner begging for mercy, but as a queen embracing her fate. The sentence had been passed. The morning of death had come. The morning of February 8th, 1587, dawned gray over Fotheringhay Castle. Frost clung to the ground, the air sharp with winter's bite. Within her chambers, Mary Stuart prepared for her final act. She dressed deliberately, choosing a velvet gown of black, a white veil for her head, and beneath them, a crimson petticoat, the color of martyrdom in the Catholic faith. Every garment was chosen with meaning. If she was to die, she would die not as a criminal, but as a queen and a witness to her faith. The sheriff of Northampton knocked at her door. Mary rose, tall and stately despite her rheumatism, and declared she was ready. Her attendants wept, but she comforted them, saying, "Do not mourn for me. I go to my Lord, and though my body falls, my soul shall rise." She was led through the corridors of the castle, past guards who bowed their heads in silence. In the great hall, a scaffold had been erected, draped in black. The crowd of witnesses, nobles, officials, soldiers, stood hushed, knowing they were about to see what had never been seen before: the execution of an anointed queen. Mary mounted the steps with grace. She knelt briefly to pray, then addressed the crowd in a steady voice. She declared she had never sought Elizabeth's death, that she died a true Catholic, that she forgave her enemies. Her words echoed through the hall, solemn and unwavering. Even her executioners paused, struck by her composure. When the time came, she removed her outer garments, revealing the crimson beneath. Gasps rippled through the hall. It was a defiant symbol, a proclamation that she died as a martyr. She laid her head upon the block, stretched out her arms, and whispered, "Into thy hands, O Lord, I commend my spirit." The first stroke of the axe missed, striking the back of her head. A groan of horror passed through the crowd. The second blow half severed the neck. Only the third completed the deed. Her head fell, the veil stained with blood, her lips still faintly moving in prayer. Then, from beneath her skirts, a small terrier emerged, soaked in her blood, refusing to leave its mistress's side. That image of loyalty, grief, and innocence haunted all who saw it. It was as though, even in death, Mary could not escape the symbols that would shape her legacy. She was 44 years old. Her body was buried in Peterborough Cathedral. But years later, her son James VI of Scotland, by then James I of England, ordered her remains moved to Westminster Abbey, laid in a tomb befitting a queen. In death, she gained the recognition denied her in life. And her son, the child she had once cradled amid betrayal and blood, united the crowns of Scotland and England, founding the Stuart dynasty. Mary Stuart's story is one of brilliance and ruin, of beauty and betrayal, of hope and despair. She was a queen at 6 days old, a bride at 15, a widow at 17, a prisoner for nearly half her life, and a martyr at 44. She was loved, hated, admired, condemned. To some, she was a saint. To others, a schemer. But to history, she remains unforgettable. Her tragedy lies not only in her death, but in the pattern of her life. A woman born into power, yet denied agency, caught in a web of politics too vast for one soul to master. She was undone not by a single enemy, but by the collision of nations, faiths, and ambitions. Her downfall was written in the very crown she wore. And yet, there is something hauntingly human in her fate. Who among us has not longed for loyalty, trusted the wrong person, or held on to hope when reason told us to surrender? Mary's story endures because it is not simply about monarchy or religion. It is about the cost of being human in a world that devours the vulnerable. Perhaps in the end, Mary was neither guilty nor innocent, neither villain nor victim, but both. She was flawed, reckless, passionate, courageous. She was a queen, yes, but also a woman who paid the ultimate price for love, ambition, and faith. And so, when we remember Mary, Queen of Scots, we do not only recall the sound of wedding bells in Notre Dame or the echo of the axe at Fotheringhay. We remember the candlelight in her prison, the ink on her letters, the blood on her gown. We remember her as a life that blazed too brightly, extinguished too soon, leaving the air heavy with smoke and questions. Was she the architect of her own downfall? Or the victim of forces beyond her control? Was she guilty of conspiracy? Or simply guilty of hoping? These are questions history cannot answer. They are questions left for us, centuries later, to ponder in silence. But one truth remains. Mary's voice, silenced on the scaffold, still whispers through the halls of time. When I think of Mary, Queen of Scots, I cannot help but feel the weight of her contradictions. She was radiant, yet shadowed. Strong, yet undone by weakness. A queen, yet always a captive of destiny, her life reminds us that crowns do not protect, that power does not save, and that even the most beautiful stories can end in blood. And perhaps that is why we tell her story still. Not to glorify her fall, but to understand the human heart beating beneath the crown. If this story moved you, if you believe forgotten voices like Mary's deserve to be heard, don't forget to subscribe to Dark Ages Unveiled. Here, history is not just dates and battles, it is blood, silence, betrayal, and hope. Join us and keep the past alive.